Sometimes the end of a story is not written with words, but with silence that begins to echo at the wrong time. In the days after the gala broadcast, Jason Miller continued his public life as if nothing had shifted. Interviews, photoshoots, and scheduled appearances filled his calendar across New York City, each moment reinforcing the image of a man who had successfully closed an old chapter and opened a brighter one. Olivia Hart stayed beside him in carefully curated appearances, her presence polished and effortless under every camera angle, while media outlets praised their union as a perfect alignment of ambition and elegance. Jason leaned into it all with confidence, speaking more freely now about growth, clarity, and leaving distractions in the past, as if repetition could permanently seal the narrative in place. Yet beneath the surface of this controlled momentum, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. An assistant mentioned a private invitation that Jason had not been informed about. A scheduling conflict emerged around a financial event hosted by an institution whose name carried more weight than any of his current partnerships. He dismissed it at first, assuming it was routine noise in a busy corporate environment, but the invitation remained, unchanged, unanswered, quietly persistent in the background of his otherwise structured world. Across the city, Naomi Brooks was no longer visible in the spaces that once defined her. There were no interviews, no public statements, no social traces that suggested reaction or resistance. Instead, she moved through quieter environments, attending meetings in understated offices where glass walls replaced spotlight and conversations carried the weight of decisions rather than attention. She had rebuilt herself in a way that did not invite observation, only recognition from those who understood the language of financial structure and institutional influence. Her name appeared in internal reports tied to consulting work that spanned multiple firms, though never in a way that connected her to public narratives. It was as if she had stepped outside the story entirely, choosing distance over explanation. On a late afternoon in Manhattan, Naomi received a message from a private executive coordinator confirming her attendance at a closed financial gathering scheduled in less than 24 hours. The location was not publicized, and the guest list was not distributed, only implied through the level of access granted. She read it once, then set her phone down without reaction, her expression remaining calm in a way that suggested she had already anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Meanwhile, Jason stood in a glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline, reviewing projected media metrics with a satisfaction that felt increasingly familiar. Olivia sat across from him, scrolling through curated headlines that reinforced their public image, when Hasson's assistant entered with a printed document instead of the usual digital notification. It was the same invitation he had noticed earlier, now confirmed through formal channels, stamped with the insignia of a private financial consortium known for controlling high-level investment pipelines across industries. The assistant hesitated slightly before placing it on the table, noting that the event required direct acknowledgement and attendance from selected figures. Hasson's confident expression tightened just enough to reveal curiosity beneath certainty. He had not expected his name to appear in such a context, especially not so soon after reshaping his public identity. Olivia glanced at the document, her tone light but observant, suggesting that opportunities of this nature usually indicated influence beyond public recognition. Hasson nodded slowly, masking a brief flicker of uncertainty with a practiced smile, then set the invitation aside as if it were simply another scheduled engagement. Yet after the room emptied, he looked at it again, longer this time, noticing details he had missed at first glance, subtle references to legacy structures and historical equity networks that did not align with anything in his current portfolio. Far away in another part of the city, Naomi stepped out of a black vehicle outside a discreet building with no signage, where security did not ask questions and elevators moved without display panels. She adjusted nothing, carried nothing visible that suggested status, yet the staff who greeted her did so with quiet recognition, guiding her upward without hesitation. As the elevator doors closed, the city outside disappeared, replaced by silence that felt intentional rather than empty. And for the first time since that night at the gala, the path she was on began to converge with something that had already started moving long before Jason Miller realized he was part of a story he no longer controlled. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical sound that felt heavier than expected, as Naomi Brooks stood inside a private vertical transport system moving upward without visible floor indicators, The silence around her intentional rather than empty, like the building itself was designed to erase hesitation before it could form into thought. Old City, Manhattan continued its rhythm of late afternoon movement, glass towers reflecting fragmented light across streets filled with people who had no awareness of what existed above their level of access. Jason Miller, meanwhile, remained in his midtown office reviewing the same invitation again, this time focusing on the institutional markings he had previously overlooked, noticing now that the document carried references to financial oversight networks that were not publicly listed within his industry connections. He leaned back in his chair, attempting to interpret it as a routine prestige event, yet something about the structure of the wording suggested a level of authority that did not align with his current trajectory. Olivia Hart entered the room holding a tablet displaying curated press coverage of their recent appearances, but paused when she saw his expression shift slightly, asking if something about the invitation concerned him. Jason dismissed the question with a brief smile, stating it was likely a standard networking gala, though his voice carried a tone that did not fully match his certainty. Across the city, Naomi stepped out of the elevator into a floor that had no signage, only a reception area designed in minimal tones of black and soft gold, where the staff acknowledged her presence without needing confirmation, guiding her through a corridor lined with glass panels that reflected nothing but controlled light and quiet motion. She did not ask questions, nor did she appear surprised, as if the environment was not new but simply a continuation of something already in motion long before her arrival. At the end of the corridor, a set of double doors opened into a conference space overlooking the skyline, where several individuals were already present, their attention shifting briefly toward her before returning to their conversations as if her arrival had been accounted for in advance. Naomi took a seat without hesitation, placing her hands calmly on the table, her expression steady, unreadable, carrying no visible tension or anticipation. Minutes later, Jason received a second notification, this time marked with a confirmation of attendance request requiring immediate acknowledgement from all invited parties, including a clause referencing legacy equity review protocols tied to multiple corporate entities he had never directly engaged with. He frowned slightly, reading it more carefully now, sensing that this was no longer an ordinary event invitation but something that intersected with systems beyond media exposure or public relations. Olivia noticed his silence again and asked what the document specifically referenced, but Jason only replied that it was likely an industry formality, though his eyes remained fixed on the unfamiliar terminology embedded within the text. In the conference space above the city, Naomi remained still as the room gradually filled, each new arrival greeted with quiet recognition by the staff who seemed to operate with a shared understanding of timing rather than instruction. A subtle shift occurred when the lights adjusted slightly, indicating the beginning of the session without announcement or introduction, reinforcing the sense that this was not a gathering for discussion but for alignment. Naomi finally looked toward the glass wall, where the city stretched outward like a living structure unaware of its own recalibration, and in that moment, somewhere far below, Jason Miller set the invitation down. Again, unaware that the distance between their realities had already begun to collapse into something he would soon no longer be able to ignore. The silence inside the upper floor conference space felt heavier as more attendees arrived, each one stepping into the room with the same restrained confidence, as if they already understood that this gathering was not designed for introductions but for alignment of something far more structured beneath the surface of conversation. Naomi Brooks remained seated near the center of the long glass table, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, observing without reaction as the final participants took their places and the doors closed with a quiet certainty that marked the transition from arrival to commencement. Across the city, Jason Miller stood in his midtown office still holding the same invitation, now joined by additional documents delivered through a secure channel, each page carrying references to legacy financial structures, dormant equity frameworks, and institutional review boards he had never directly engaged with. Olivia Hart watched him carefully as he silently scanned the pages again, noticing how his earlier confidence had begun to give way to something more measured, not fear, but recalibration, as if he was beginning to understand that the invitation was not social in nature but structural in implication. He set the papers down and said it must be a high-level industry consortium event, yet his tone no longer carried the same ease as before, revealing a subtle uncertainty he could not fully conceal. Back at the conference space above the city, the lighting shifted slightly again, signaling the official beginning of the session without announcement, and a senior coordinator stepped forward to acknowledge attendance while avoiding any form of personalization, reinforcing the sense that identity here was secondary to position within a larger framework. Naomi's attention remained fixed forward, not toward any individual, but toward the projection wall that had just activated, displaying a map of interconnected corporate entities, financial pathways, and historical ownership layers that spanned multiple sectors across New York and beyond. There was no explanation given, only visual structure, as if understanding was expected rather than taught. Hassan received another notification at that moment, this one confirming that attendance at the upcoming session would involve participation in a review process tied to verified historical equity alignment across multiple organizations. And for the first time he paused longer than usual, reading each line slowly as if searching for context that was not immediately visible. Olivia asked if it was something that required concern, but Jason only replied that it was likely procedural compliance, though his eyes lingered on the phrase historical equity alignment longer than anything else on the page. In the upper conference space, Naomi finally shifted her gaze slightly as a figure entered the room with a level of presence that subtly changed the atmosphere without requiring introduction, and though no one reacted outwardly, the spacing between conversations adjusted in a way that suggested acknowledgement of authority rather than personality. The projection expanded again, revealing deeper layers of corporate interconnection that extended beyond visible brands into legacy structures that had been inactive for years in public records but remained operational within private frameworks. Hassan, still in his office, leaned forward slightly as he reread the same section of the document, now noticing references that linked multiple organizations in ways he had never been made aware of during his rise, creating a quiet tension between what he believed he controlled and what appeared to already be in motion without his input. Olivia observed him without speaking, her earlier confidence replaced by curiosity as she realized this was no longer about publicity or opportunity but something far more formalized. About the city, Naomi remained silent as the coordinator announced that the first phase of verification would begin shortly, and that all participants would be assessed not by reputation but by structural association within the system being reviewed. There was no reaction in her expression, only stillness that suggested familiarity. Was this type of environment, as if she had already moved beyond the point where revelation could alter expectation. And somewhere below, Jason Miller placed the documents down once more, unaware that the path he thought was opening upward had already been shaped long before he was invited into it. The atmosphere inside the upper conference space shifted again as the projection expanded across the glass wall, revealing deeper layers of financial networks that no longer resembled simple corporate structures but instead appeared as a living system of interconnected ownership, dormant agreements, and historical authorization layers that extended across multiple industries and jurisdictions, creating a silence in the room that was not confusion but recognition that something far larger than any single participant was being revealed in real time. Naomi Brooks remained still in her seat, her eyes following the moving data without visible reaction, as if she was not seeing something new but confirming something already understood long before this moment, while around her, other attendees adjusted their posture subtly, their earlier confidence replaced by a quieter form of attention that came when systems of control were no longer abstract but visible. Across the city, Jason Miller received a third wave of documents, this time accompanied by a digital access request requiring verification through institutional credentials he did not fully recognize. And as he attempted to process the information, he noticed that his name was not listed as an origin point but rather as a secondary reference within a larger structural network he had never been aware of, creating a tension in his expression that Olivia Hart immediately noticed as she stepped closer to his desk, asking whether the event was still something related to networking or if it had moved into something more formal than he had initially assumed. Hassan hesitated before answering, stating that it appeared to be an advanced industry compliance summit, yet his voice no longer carried certainty, only interpretation under pressure. In the conference space above Manhattan, the coordinator spoke again, explaining that the first phase of verification would now begin and that each participant's presence would be analyzed not through identity or reputation but through structural positioning within legacy frameworks that had been activated through predefined conditions established years earlier. A subtle shift passed through the room as the implication settled, not through reaction but through silence that deepened as understanding formed unevenly among those present. Naomi's attention moved briefly toward the projection again, where her name appeared in a historical ledger connected to older financial configurations that had been dormant in public records but remained intact within private systems, and she did not react, only observed, as if confirming the completion of a sequence she had already stepped into long before this gathering began. Below in Midtown Manhattan, Jason leaned forward slightly as he reopened the documents, now noticing references that linked multiple corporate entities under a unified framework of historical equity alignment protocols, and for the first time he realized that the invitation he had received was not an opportunity for visibility but a requirement for validation within a structure that existed independently of his personal achievements or public image. Olivia watched him closely, sensing the shift in his understanding as he began to reread sections more slowly, his earlier assumptions breaking down into fragmented interpretations that no longer held consistent meaning. In the upper conference space, the lighting adjusted once more, signaling the transition from observation to active verification, and participants were instructed to confirm digital credentials that would determine their classification within the system being reviewed. Naomi raised her hand only slightly to complete the process, her expression unchanged, while others followed with varying degrees of hesitation, and the projection updated in real time as layers of corporate history, financial ownership, and legacy associations aligned into a unified map that extended far beyond the room itself. Hassan, still in his office, received a final notification indicating that his participation status had been updated to pending review, requiring direct acknowledgement from a higher authority node, and as he stared at the screen, he finally understood that the story he believed he was part of had already been written through systems he never controlled. While above the city, Naomi remained motionless as the verification phase continued, and the structure around her moved closer to revealing its final configuration. The verification phase inside the upper conference space shifted into a deeper stage as the projection across the glass wall reorganized itself into a layered structure of institutional data, where each participant's identity was no longer treated as a personal record but as a sequence of historical alignments, financial linkages, and dormant authorization paths that had now been reactivated under controlled conditions, creating an atmosphere where silence carried more weight than any spoken instruction. Naomi Brooks remained seated without movement, her attention fixed on the evolving map of interconnected entities that now extended beyond domestic corporations into international holding structures, as if the system being displayed had always existed beneath visible economies but had only now been made readable through a coordinated unlock of legacy frameworks. Across the city, Jason Miller received a formal digital confirmation requesting immediate acknowledgement of classification status within the review process, and as he read the updated language, he noticed that the tone had shifted from invitation to requirement, indicating that participation was no longer optional but structurally embedded within systems tied to his previous financial activities and business affiliations. Olivia Hart stood beside him, observing the change in his expression as he silently navigated through sections referencing historical equity validation protocols and cross-entity authorization checks, none of which he recalled authorizing or encountering during his career, yet all of which now appeared connected to his name in a way that suggested long-standing integration within a broader framework he had never been fully aware of. He attempted to maintain composure, stating that it was likely a standard compliance review for high-value industry participants, but the hesitation in his voice revealed a growing recognition that the scale of the process exceeded conventional corporate procedures. Above Manhattan, the conference coordinator announced the transition into the second verification stage, where structural consistency would be measured across all linked entities in real time, and the projection expanded again to reveal cascading networks of ownership, funding pathways, and dormant governance structures that synchronized across multiple jurisdictions with a precision that suggested long-term design rather than recent development. Naomi's gaze followed the movement of the data without reaction, her stillness unchanged even as her name appeared within a historical alignment layer connected to prior financial restructuring phases that predated public awareness of the organizations involved. There was no surprise in her expression, only confirmation, as if the system was not revealing something new but completing a pattern she had already accounted for long ago. Jason, still in Midtown, leaned closer to his screen as additional files unlocked, showing references to legacy agreements that tied his early ventures to a series of holding entities he had never directly interacted with, creating a subtle but undeniable shift in his understanding of how far back the current review extended. Olivia asked whether he needed assistance interpreting the documents, but Jason only shook his head, continuing to read as the structure of the information began to form a pattern that no longer felt isolated but interconnected, extending beyond his personal achievements into a network of institutional dependencies that reframed his entire professional history. In the conference space, participants were instructed to proceed with enhanced verification steps requiring confirmation through encrypted identity layers linked to historical financial behavior, and as each individual complied, the projection updated in real time, tightening the alignment between recorded history and current classification. Naomi completed the process without hesitation, her input triggering a quiet confirmation on the system that registered her position within a stabilized segment of the framework, while others followed at varying speeds, their reactions ranging from calm acceptance to silent uncertainty as the implications of the structure became more visible. Below the city skyline, Jason received a final alert indicating that his classification status had been escalated to secondary review pending executive validation from a higher authority node within the system, and as he stared at the message, the realization began to settle that the invitation he once believed represented opportunity had instead marked the beginning of a reassessment of everything he thought he controlled, while far above him, Naomi remained motionless as the verification architecture continued to expand, moving steadily toward a conclusion that had been prepared long before either of them understood they were part of it. The escalation into the next verification layer unfolded across the upper conference space with a controlled precision that removed all sense of casual interpretation, as the projection wall restructured itself once again into a multi-dimensional financial map that now included temporal markers, showing not only current ownership structures but also historical decision pathways that had been quietly embedded into institutional systems over many years, creating a layered architecture where every participant was no longer evaluated as an individual but as a node within a continuously evolving network of accountability and legacy alignment. Naomi Brooks remained seated in absolute stillness, her eyes following the shifting data streams as they expanded outward beyond domestic frameworks into international holding patterns, each update reinforcing the sense that what was being revealed was not new information but rather the exposure of something that had always existed beneath visible markets, only now becoming readable through synchronized access. Across Manhattan, Jason Miller received an immediate system-level notification indicating that his classification status had been temporarily frozen pending executive tier validation, a designation that carried no explanation beyond procedural acknowledgement, and as he opened the associated file, he saw his corporate history reconstructed into a structured timeline that linked his early ventures, partnerships, and financial transitions into a consolidated framework he had never previously been shown. Olivia Hart stood beside him in silence as she observed the shift in his focus, noticing how his confidence had been replaced by a measured stillness, as if he was recalibrating his understanding of everything he had achieved, now seeing it through a structure that extended beyond personal agency into institutional mapping he did not control. A attempted to speak, stating that such reviews were likely part of high-level compliance restructuring across the industry, yet the lack of conviction in his tone revealed that he was no longer fully aligned with the explanation he was offering. About the city, the coordinator announced that the system had now entered integration phase, where all verified identities would be cross-referenced against legacy authorization frameworks to ensure continuity between historical and current financial structures, and as the projection expanded further, Naomi's record appeared again, this time connected to multiple dormant governance layers that had been activated simultaneously across different jurisdictions. There was no reaction from her, only continued observation, as if the confirmation of this alignment had been anticipated long before the system revealed it. In Hasson's office, the display updated again, showing that his participation was now linked to a secondary review stream requiring direct correlation with higher authority entities responsible for structural validation, and as he read the message, he realized that the process was not evaluating success or reputation, but rather tracing the foundation upon which that success had been built, layer by layer, without omission. Olivia asked whether this level of review was common for individuals at his status, but Jason only responded that it appeared to be part of a broader institutional audit cycle, though his eyes remained fixed on the expanding map of connections that no longer felt linear but interdependent in ways he had never considered. In the upper conference space, the lighting dimmed slightly as the system transitioned into final alignment scanning, where all verified data points would be consolidated into a unified structural model, And Naomi's position within that model stabilized into a central reference layer that indicated prior involvement in foundational financial restructuring processes that predated the current system state. She did not move or speak, her presence unchanged as the environment around her completed another phase of synchronization. Far below, Jason Miller received a final alert indicating that executive tier confirmation was required before any further access would be granted, and as he stared at the message, the realization settled that his current standing was no longer defined by public success or perception, but by a hidden architecture of validation that had already begun reshaping his entire narrative, while above him, Naomi remained motionless within a system that was steadily revealing how deeply their lives had been intertwined long before either of them understood the true structure governing it. The final verification layer expanded across the upper conference space with a noticeable shift in rhythm, as the projection no longer displayed separate strands of data but instead converged into a unified structural model where every identity, transaction, and historical financial movement linked to the system was being resolved into a single synchronized framework that updated in real time across multiple jurisdictions, creating an environment where nothing remained isolated and every presence in the room became part of a larger continuous evaluation process. Naomi Brooks remained seated without movement, her gaze steady on the evolving structure as it stabilized into a configuration that now highlighted not only her own historical financial associations but also deeper foundational links that connected her to earlier institutional restructuring events that had shaped multiple corporate systems long before the current review had begun, yet she showed no sign of surprise, only quiet acknowledgement as if the confirmation of this alignment had simply completed something already known. Across Manhattan, Jason Miller received an immediate escalation notice indicating that executive tier validation had been initiated, requiring direct confirmation from a centralized authority node before any further classification updates could proceed, and as he opened the expanded profile, he saw his entire professional timeline reorganized into a structured network of financial dependencies, showing how early investments, partnerships, and corporate transitions were no longer separate events, but interconnected pathways within a legacy system he had never been informed he was part of. Olivia Hart stood beside him, her attention fixed on the screen as the complexity of the data increased, and for the first time her earlier confidence faded into silence, replaced by a careful observation of how deeply Jason's history was being reframed by information he had never seen before, creating a tension in the room that neither of them addressed directly. Hasson attempted to maintain composure, stating that this must be part of a global compliance harmonization process affecting multiple high-value participants, yet his tone revealed that he was now interpreting rather than asserting, as if the certainty he once carried had begun to fracture under the weight of structural evidence. About the city, the conference coordinator announced that final consolidation was now in progress, where all verified identities and legacy frameworks would be merged into a single authoritative model designed to reconcile historical records with current operational structures, and as this announcement was made, the projection shifted again to reveal Naomi's position not as an isolated participant but as a foundational reference node within earlier financial restructuring phases that had influenced the very system now being activated. She did not react, her posture unchanged, as if her role within the structure had already been fully accepted long before this moment of revelation. In Hasson's office, the system update completed another cycle, marking his status as pending executive review under centralized authority confirmation, and as he read the notification repeatedly, he began to understand that his standing within the industry was not being questioned in isolation but was being measured against a broader architecture of historical alignment that extended far beyond his personal achievements or public reputation. Olivia asked softly whether this level of review was typical for individuals at his scale of influence, but Jason did not answer immediately. His focus locked on the expanding network map that now showed his entire career embedded within overlapping systems of ownership and authorization he had never directly engaged with. In the upper conference space, the lighting dimmed further as the system reached its final synchronization stage, and Naomi remained still while the data stabilized into a complete structural model where every participant was assigned a precise relational position within the historical framework, signaling that the verification process was no longer evaluating individuals separately but was instead completing the architecture of a system that had been building itself silently across years, now revealing its full configuration in real time across the city below. The final synchronization phase completed across the upper conference space with a stillness that felt absolute, As if the entire structure of the system had reached a point where no further adjustment was needed and every layer of historical financial data, ownership mapping, and legacy authorization frameworks had finally converged into a single unified configuration that extended beyond the room and into the broader institutional network of Manhattan and beyond. Naomi Brooks remained seated at the center of this convergence, her presence unchanged as the projection stabilized around her position, identifying her not as a participant subject to evaluation but as a reference point within the foundational architecture that had enabled the system's current structure to exist, a designation that appeared without emphasis or celebration, only quiet confirmation within the data model itself. Across Midtown Manhattan, Jason Miller received the final executive tier validation prompt, requiring immediate acknowledgement before any further classification updates could proceed, and as he read the message, he noticed that his entire professional history had been condensed into a structured sequence of interdependent financial layers that no longer resembled a personal narrative but instead formed part of a larger institutional design he had, unknowingly operated within for years. Olivia Hart stood beside him, no longer speaking, her attention fixed on the screen as she observed how every assumption she had formed about his success was being reframed through a system that evaluated continuity rather than achievement, and for the first time there was no attempt at interpretation, only silence as the scale of the structure became fully visible. Hasson eventually spoke in a low voice, stating that this must represent the final stage of a global financial harmonization process, yet even as he said it, the words carried uncertainty, as if he was trying to anchor meaning to something that no longer responded to simple explanation. Above the city, the coordinator announced that full integration had been achieved, and that all verified entities would now be permanently mapped into a stabilized structural framework where historical records, current financial positions, and legacy governance systems would operate as a single continuous model, removing separation between past and present within the system. In that moment, the projection displayed Naomi's designation as a foundational node within pre-existing financial restructuring frameworks, confirming her role not as an active participant in the current process but as part of the original structure upon which the entire system had been built, a revelation that passed through the room without reaction, as if understanding had already been internalized before acknowledgement was required. Hasson, still in his office, received a final status update indicating that executive validation had been completed at the highest authority level, and that his classification within the system had been permanently defined based on historical alignment rather than current. Standing, causing him to pause as he realized that what he had believed to be independent success had always been measured within a framework he never controlled or fully perceived. Olivia looked at him quietly, sensing that no further explanation would change what had already been established, while Jason slowly lowered the device, his expression reflecting the weight of a realization that extended beyond professional consequence into structural truth. In the upper conference space, the lighting returned to its original state as the system entered completion mode, signaling that the verification process was no longer active because there was nothing left to verify, only a finalized architecture that now governed interpretation itself. Naomi remained still as the projection faded, her position unchanged within the final model, not as a subject of change but as a constant embedded within the foundation of everything that had been revealed, while far below the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that the structure beneath its visible surface had already completed its transformation into a fully defined system that had been silently in place all along.